لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي رب زدني علما رب زدني علما وعملا وإخلاصا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم آمين. Okay. So we are at the fourth point. Lam Iqbal is talking about the mystic experiences and its characteristics and its similarities and dissimilarities with our normal experience. So this is the fourth point. Since the quality of mystic experience is to be directly experienced, not the content, I guess. That's what he's saying here. It is obvious that it cannot be communicated. If he's talking about quality, and in quality we will talk about, for example, if we talk about quality of experience, we can talk about its intensity, for example, its uniqueness, for example. It cannot be communicated. I mean, he can't be talking here about content, because if he does, then probably it will contradict what he said before in the last point. But if he's talking about quality, then in a sense, even normal experiences, so-called quality, can't be communicated as such on the one hand. On the other, can't be communicated in the sense that, let's talk about it a bit. So experience. The quality. So if by quality we mean unique, subjective state a person or subject goes through when he or she experiences something, then probably any experience's quality cannot be communicated. Communicated meaning, of course it can be communicated, but what I think he means is it cannot be communicated. Exactly. For example, it's like pain. Nobody else in a sense can feel the pain I'm feeling. But that doesn't mean that we can't communicate the feeling of pain. Especially we can communicate the feeling of pain because, presumably other persons have this experience as well. So probably what differentiates the so-called mystic experience from the normal experience is that since normal experience we have this intersubjective history with other fellow human beings of having experienced that experience. Probably that's why it's more culpable or more capable of being communicated, even in its quality. Even though the experience I experience, that experience nobody else can experience it the same way, in which the pain I go through, no one can go through that pain. But since mystic experience is a rare form of experience, it's not widely shared. It doesn't have a broad-based intersubjective history. That's why probably it can't be communicated even at the level at which our normal experience can be communicated. But I guess it can't be. I guess here we are assuming that he's not talking about content, because if he's talking about content, that it will contradict what he has said and what he will say and other obvious facts. But what he means probably is the quality, and even then by communication he means, surely it can be communicated in a way, even with revelation, which is not a mystic experience. For example, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from time to time, and even in the Quran, it has been described, and the quality of that experience is also described in the, for example, Imam Bukhari, the first chapter of his book is how was the beginning of the revelation, or something like that. So in that there are narration from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam where the quality of experience is also communicated in a sense. But I think what he means by cannot be communicated is more specific, that it you can't go through, or you can't experience, or that specific experience can't be communicated in a way in which my pain cannot be felt by anyone else. And what differentiates here a normal experience from the mystic experience is, since the mystic experience is a very specific and less widely shared, or not widely shared at all, experience among human beings, communicating its subjective side is even harder than even our normal experience. So since the quality of mystic experience is to be directly experienced, so that's not unique to mystic experience. The quality of any experience is to be directly experienced. It is obvious. I don't think it's obvious, but it is obvious that it cannot be communicated, and by communication we mean something is specific. We just try to explain. That's what makes more sense to me at this point, anyway. Then he goes on to say that mystic states. So he's talking about states, not contents. And states of the normal experience are also very hard to communicate in that sense. The mystic experience are more like feelings. See that? That's why I gave the example of pain than thought. The state, mystic states are, so not just mystic states, even normal states are like feeling. I mean, the interpretation which the mystic or the prophet. So we don't accept Allama Iqbal's equation of mystic with the prophet, because they are totally different types of experience, if you want to call them experience. The interpretation which the mystic or the prophet puts, the interpretation or content of his religious consciousness cannot be conveyed. The interpretation which the mystic or prophet puts on the content of his religious can others in the form of proposition, but the content itself cannot be so transmitted. Now here I think this falsifies sort of if he really means content, then it's actually the whole he's contradicting himself. But let's see. Mystic states are more like feeling than thought. Okay, the interpretation which the mystic or the prophet puts on the content. But the interpretation Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam gives of the revelation is from Allah as well. So I don't know how you can say that the interpretation which the mystic or the prophet puts on the content. But if we are talking about experience in general, so mystic, so the mystic go through some sort of experience. So I mean, personally, I don't equate mystic with the Sufi. Even Sufi, let alone the Prophet. So, but we'll go along with Alamibal just to see what he is getting at. So the mystic experience, and there's a content in that, and there is a quality of that. And obviously then, if he wants to, when the mystic is out of that state, then he or she can communicate if there is a content as such, and then interpretation of that content, which for a mystic would be self-interpretation, and then other people can interpret that content as well, even though they won't have access to this quality unless that quality was communicated as well. But even if that quality was communicated, it can't be communicated fully. So the self-interpretation of a mystic, and that self-interpretation would be, so before self-interpretation you have communication of the content, if he communicates, and quality. So there is a difference. So interpretation is on top of that, although in a sense, or strictly speaking, no communication is without interpretation as such. So we are talking about talking here in relative terms, and then Sufi can interpret this content and this as well, and other people can be, because now it's in public domain if it has been communicated, so they can even disagree. And just because a mystic has gone through some experience doesn't mean that his or her self-interpretation is superior to others as far as the relation to the truth is concerned. Okay, so that's what I want to say, but let's go back to Allah Iqbal. So now he's saying that the interpretation which the mystic or the prophet puts on the content of his religious content can be conveyed, okay, to others in the form of proposition, but the content itself, the content itself cannot be so transmitted. But as we said, content can be transmitted, communicated. If interpretation can be communicated, then content can be interpreted as well, even though. So let's go back to what we already said, and probably we'll stop at that. So experience, any experience, but mystic experience is even more unique, so quality. So they can be communicated as we saw. But what Allama Iqbal is saying, that communication would be interpretation of a mystic and not the communication of content as such. But I will contest this claim at various levels. And here is my line of thought, and we'll finish at that. Firstly, it's very hard, strictly speaking, to separate any communication from interpretation. So when we differentiate between content and interpretation of any experience, it's always relative. So in that sense, we can say that mystic or even in normal experience, but we will communicate the content of experience. But this communication would involve, like any other communication, self-interpretation or interpretation. But the level of interpretation in this would be less than explicit interpretation, let's say. So relatively speaking, this is content rather than interpretation. But this content can be then interpreted by Sufi at the explicit level again and again, and others can do that too. Okay, so I think what Iqbal is trying to do is to make a clear-cut distinction between communication of content and interpretation of the content, and that's communication of that interpretation. And then he's saying that, strictly speaking, content cannot be communicated to others because it will involve interpretation. So what I'm saying is that you can't get over interpretation at any rate. So the difference between interpretation and the communication of content is always relative. So what we can do is say that here he's communicating content, but it involves interpretation of a sort at implicit level. But here, when he is actually interpreting, that is interpretation is at the explicit level. And even like when Sufi or anybody experience something, even self-understanding, for example, there can't be any pure self-understanding. Even at that level, there is no pure communication of the content, in a sense, and every self-understanding also involves self-interpretation, etc. So the strict distinction Allama Iqbal is trying to make between the content and the interpretation is, I think, untenable. Okay, so I think we'll stop here and we'll continue from here, inshallah, next time.